Level Up or Die by Luna Rain. Chapter 1. The Unseen Arena. The city of Neoterra sprawled beneath a brooding sky, its skyline a jagged silhouette against the dull, polluted clouds. In this future world, humanity had become a mere shadow of what it once was, its inhabitants tethered to an artificial digital reality. Survival was no longer about securing food or shelter. It was about playing the game, the deadly game. Mila Walker sat in a dimly lit room, the cold metal chair beneath her digging into her back. The room smelled faintly of dust and rust, an unpleasant combination that matched the state of the world. Outside, the streets were filled with the constant hum of neon lights and distant sirens, a reminder that the city never truly slept. But inside, there was silence, a heavy kind of stillness that only those who had lost everything could understand. Mila was an outcast, a person who had fallen through the cracks of society. She wasn't the kind of person who would have ever stood out before the games, before the system had changed everything. But now, she was just another pawn in a world where only the strongest and the smartest survived. The games were brutal, unforgiving, and those who failed had their lives erased, wiped away as if they never existed. The stakes were clear. Level up or die. Her hand hovered over the interface in front of her, a glowing screen embedded into the desk. It was time to enter the next challenge, the next game, and she had to win. The alternative was unthinkable. Mila's fingers trembled as she tapped the screen, bringing the game selection menu to life. There were hundreds of options, each one more dangerous than the last. She had seen players fall, their screams echoing in her mind long after they were gone. But there was no other choice. Everyone she knew was either already in the game or too far gone to matter. Her profile flickered to life on the screen, showing her level. Barely a blip in the grand scheme of things, but she had fought for every point, every inch she'd gained in this hellish world. She had started with nothing, just like the rest of them, but she had learned quickly. The rules were simple: survive or perish. And the game, it wasn't just a game. It was a fight for life itself. The other players, a motley crew of desperate souls, appeared as avatars on the screen. Some looked like warriors, others like hackers, and a few seemed completely out of place, their features more glitchy than real. But it didn't matter what they looked like. In this world, the only thing that mattered was their ability to win. Mila took a deep breath, staring at the countdown clock ticking away in the corner of the screen. The challenge would begin soon. Her heart pounded in her chest, the adrenaline already building. She had to be ready. The game wouldn't wait for her to catch up. Suddenly, a message flashed across the screen. Welcome, Player 042. The next challenge is ready to begin. Prepare yourself for the arena. The arena. It was the most infamous game of them all, a virtual world where only the strongest survived. Players were dropped into a massive, ever-shifting battlefield, and the last one standing was the winner. It was a game that had claimed countless lives, and for some reason, Mila had never been able to escape its clutches. But this time, she had to win. There was no room for failure. The lights in the room flickered, and for a moment, everything went dark. Then, the familiar hum of the neural interface kicked in, and Mila's body jerked forward as her consciousness was ripped from her physical form and thrust into the virtual world. The transition was always disorienting, but Mila had learned to ignore it. Her surroundings slowly came into focus. The arena was a sprawling, chaotic environment. Towering skyscrapers, rusted vehicles, and vast, empty streets stretched out before her. The sky overhead was a sickly orange, the remnants of a dying world. The ground beneath her feet was cracked, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. She wasn't alone. Others had already arrived, their avatars materializing around her. Some were already sprinting toward weapons caches, while others lingered, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. Mila didn't have time to hesitate. She moved swiftly, her training kicking in. The first rule of the arena: never wait. The second: always have an escape plan. The ground rumbled beneath her as the first wave of enemies appeared, digital constructs designed to challenge players like Mila. They were fast, ruthless, and nearly impossible to defeat without the right gear. Mila gritted her teeth, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife she carried on her waist. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Before she could take another step, a group of players appeared, their avatars running toward her. They were fast, their movements calculated. Mila knew these players, some of them anyway. They were the ones who had climbed their way to the top by using others, exploiting every weakness. They would have no hesitation in taking her down. Move. One of them snarled, his avatar towering over her. This is our territory now. Mila's heart skipped a beat, but she refused to back down. She wasn't about to let anyone push her around. Not here, not now. She had a point to prove, and she wouldn't let anyone take it away from her. The others circled around her, closing in. Mila felt the pressure mounting, but she wasn't afraid. She had trained for this. She had learned to fight, to survive in a world where everything, every moment, could be her last. Suddenly, a loud explosion echoed through the arena, followed by a shockwave that sent the players scattering. Mila stumbled, but quickly regained her balance. She didn't know what had caused the explosion, but it didn't matter. The chaos was her chance. Without wasting another second, Mila sprinted toward the nearest building, her mind racing. The arena was a dangerous place, full of enemies both real and digital. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not for a second as she neared the building. A strange sound filled the air, a low, mechanical hum, like something was activating. Mila didn't stop to investigate. She just kept running, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had to survive. The only way out of the arena was through the next challenge, and that meant leveling up. She would do whatever it took. Chapter 2. The First Strike. The arena was a shifting landscape of chaos, each moment bringing new dangers. Mila's heart hammered as she darted through the half-crumbling building, her feet pounding against the debris-strewn floor. The air was thick with tension, every corner hiding potential threats. She could hear the muffled sounds of distant explosions, the crash of falling walls, and the clattering of weapons being drawn by the other players. Mila's mind raced. She needed to think, to plan her next move. The digital world wasn't like the real one. Here, she couldn't rely on the same instincts she'd honed in the streets of Neoterra. Here, everything was a game. A deadly one where the slightest mistake could cost her life. She paused for a moment, pressing her back against a wall, trying to steady her breathing. The virtual environment around her was more realistic than she liked to admit. It felt too real. The rough texture of the walls beneath her fingertips, the pungent odor of rust and decay. But it was just a simulation, at least that's what they wanted her to believe. The screen in front of her flickered with a new message. Challenge mode, eliminate target alpha. Reward, plus 100 XP. Time limit, 20 minutes. Mila frowned. A new mission. The message confirmed her worst fear. Alpha, a name she recognized all too well. He was one of the top players in the game, a ruthless strategist known for his ability to manipulate others into doing his dirty work. She had crossed paths with him before in smaller challenges, but never like this. If Alpha was involved, this would be no ordinary mission. The clock was ticking, and she couldn't afford to hesitate. The information on the screen gave her a rough location. A nearby plaza, a few blocks away. She had to move quickly if she wanted to avoid Alpha and his followers. The last thing she needed was to be caught in the crossfire of a player who knew how to play the game. Mila stepped into the hallway, keeping low. She knew the rules by heart. No one was your friend in the arena. Alliances were temporary at best. Backstabbing always just a moment away. Trust no one, not even the people who seemed like allies. As she crept through the building, her eyes darted around, scanning for any signs of movement. The game's AI was always watching, constantly adjusting the environment to make things more difficult for the players. And while the digital constructs were challenging, it was the other players she had to worry about most. A noise broke her concentration. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate. She froze, pressing herself back into the shadows. Her heart raced. She wasn't ready for an encounter, not yet. Not with Alpha's people. She couldn't stay hidden forever. The footsteps grew louder, and Mila cursed under her breath. She had to make a choice, fight or flee. The choice was simple. She wasn't about to let someone else take her out before she had a chance to level up. Mila peered around the corner. 3 avatars rounded the corner, all armed and ready for a fight. They were wearing the same insignia, a crimson skull etched into their virtual armor. The Crimson Syndicate, Alpha's inner circle. Her fingers clenched around her knife, the only weapon she had on hand. She couldn't afford to take them all on at once, but she had to make it count. She needed an opening. The Syndicate members were chatting, their voices distorted by the game's audio filters, but she could hear enough. They were discussing their strategy, plotting their next move. The leader of the group, a tall figure with glowing red eyes, was the first to notice something wasn't right. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice sharp and alert. Mila froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. She was seconds away from being discovered. "Yeah," another voice replied. "I thought I saw something move." Mila didn't wait. She acted with a quick motion. She darted out of the shadows, charging toward the first Syndicate member. He didn't see her coming. She was upon him in an instant, her knife slicing through the air. It was a clean strike, just a flick of her wrist, and the avatar crumpled to the ground, disappearing in a burst of static. The other 2 Syndicate members reacted instantly, drawing their weapons and charging at her. Mila didn't hesitate. She rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding a volley of digital bullets that tore through the air. The game system allowed for near-perfect simulation, and the pain of a near miss sent a sharp jolt through her nerves. She wasn't fast enough. The second member lunged at her, his glowing sword slashing through the air. Mila barely had time to block with her knife, the force of the strike rattling her arm. She stumbled back, trying to regain her footing. "You're dead, little girl." The second syndicate member sneered. Mila's mind raced. She needed to get away. If she didn't, this fight would be over before it even started. But she wasn't without options. She had learned long ago that the key to survival in the arena wasn't just strength. It was ingenuity. With a swift motion, she activated a special ability, Decoy. The game's mechanics allowed her to create a holographic copy of herself, a temporary illusion that could confuse enemies. The decoy appeared to stumble backward, mimicking Mila's every movement. The syndicate members hesitated, confused for just a moment. It was enough. Mila darted to the side, weaving through the crumbling building, her breath shallow as she ran. She had to find higher ground. The terrain of the arena was unpredictable, but she knew there were vantage points where she could outsmart her opponents. The sound of heavy footsteps followed her, but Mila didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Every second counted. She reached the edge of the plaza, her feet pounding against the cracked pavement. The sky above was a twisted orange, and the faint glow of a distant explosion lit the horizon. She had to move fast. Alpha's followers wouldn't let her get away so easily. With a glance over her shoulder, she spotted them. The syndicate was still hot on her tail, their weapons raised and ready for another attack. But this time, Mila was prepared. Chapter 3. The bait and switch. Mila's heart thudded in her chest as she sprinted through the desolate streets of the plaza. The digital constructs of the arena shifted around her. The once sturdy buildings now crumbling ruins. The streets littered with debris and forgotten relics of the old world. The sky above was a sickly shade of orange, casting a dim glow over everything, making it hard to distinguish what was real from what was simulated. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the sound of it muffled in her ears as adrenaline surged through her veins. The syndicate was still behind her, their footsteps echoing in the empty space, getting closer with every passing second. Mila's mind raced, her options narrowing with every moment. She couldn't outrun them. She couldn't fight them all head-on. There was only one thing left to do: trap them. Her fingers twitched, and she accessed the game's interface, pulling up the map of the surrounding area. The plaza was large, but it had a few strategic points that could give her an edge. The question was whether she could get to them in time. She glanced over her shoulder again, seeing the crimson figures of the syndicate closing in. They were faster than she had anticipated. Mila cursed under her breath. She had underestimated them. They were ruthless, calculating, and relentless. Everything she didn't want to face. But she wasn't just going to be a pawn in their game. Not today. Her eyes landed on a nearby building, its skeletal frame half collapsed but still standing. It had a vantage point, a second-floor balcony with a perfect view of the plaza. If she could get up there, she could pick them off one by one, using the environment to her advantage. It was risky, but she had no other choice. With a final glance at the map, she darted toward the building, zigzagging through the ruins to throw off her pursuers. She could hear the sounds of them gaining, the heavy clank of their boots against the pavement, the rustling of their weapons. They were close now, too close. Mila reached the base of the building, her eyes scanning the debris for a way up. She spotted a metal pipe protruding from the wall, an imperfect but effective ladder. Without hesitation, she grabbed onto it, pulling herself up as quickly as she could. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she ignored the pain. She couldn't afford to slow down. Not now that as she reached the second-floor balcony. She hoisted herself over the edge, landing with a soft thud. She pressed her back against the wall, waiting for the syndicate to pass. She could hear them now, just below her, their voices low but filled with malice. She went this way. One of them growled, his voice cutting through the silence. Mila's pulse quickened. They hadn't seen her yet. If she timed this right, she could strike before they even knew what hit them. She checked the weapons cache she'd scavenged earlier. A few grenades, a compact rifle, and a couple of med packs. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. She attached the grenades to her belt, the cold metal a reminder of how dangerous things had gotten. Mila never liked to rely on explosives, but in this game it was survival or nothing. Her fingers brushed over the rifle, adjusting the settings. She would need precision. She could take out one of them from here, but the other two would be a problem. She peered over the edge of the balcony, watching the syndicate members below. They were spread out, searching for any sign of movement. Mila's gaze locked onto the leader, the tall figure with the red eyes. He was standing just below her, his rifle slung across his back as he scanned the area. If she could eliminate him, the rest would scatter. They wouldn't know how to function without their leader. Her finger hovered over the trigger. One shot. That's all she needed. Suddenly, a loud explosion rocked the building, the shockwave sending Mila stumbling backward. The syndicate members reacted immediately, ducking for cover and drawing their weapons. They were on high alert now, and the element of surprise was gone. Mila cursed, her heart pounding. She didn't know what had caused the explosion, but she wasn't about to wait around to find out. She scrambled to her feet, scanning the area for another way to outmaneuver them. The syndicate had already regrouped, taking cover behind a nearby pile of rubble. They were smart, far smarter than she had anticipated. They knew how to play the game, how to think ahead, and they had the numbers. But Mila wasn't without tricks of her own. She quickly activated another special ability. Cloak. It wasn't perfect, just a simple invisibility feature that would allow her to move unseen for a short period of time. It wasn't long enough to escape completely, but it was enough to give her an opening. The world around her shimmered as her body became translucent, blending with the environment. She took a deep breath, feeling her heartbeat slow as the cloak wrapped around her like a second skin. Moving carefully, she dropped to the ground and began to crawl toward the edge of the building. Her mind was working faster than her body. She had to be precise. The cloak wouldn't last long, and she couldn't waste it. She reached the edge and peered over. The syndicate was still searching, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. The leader, who had been so close, was now further away, too far for her to get a clean shot. But there was another option. Mila's eyes flicked to the grenade she had attached to her belt. The blast radius would take out at least two of them if she timed it right. It was a risky play, but it was the only play. She reached down, grabbing the grenade and pulling the pin. With a steady hand, she tossed it toward the syndicate's position, watching as it bounced and rolled into their line of sight. The moment it hit the ground, Mila turned and ran, her heart hammering in her chest. The explosion was deafening. The shockwave rattled the entire building, and the syndicate was caught in the blast, their avatars disintegrating into pixels. Mila didn't look back. She didn't have time to savor the victory. She had to keep moving as the smoke cleared. Mila emerged from her cloak, breathing heavily, her hands trembling. She had done it, for now at least. But the game was far from over. The countdown for the next challenge had already begun. And Alpha was still out there. Chapter 4. The Descent. The smoke from the explosion slowly dissipated, leaving the plaza eerily silent. Mila crouched low, listening carefully. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not for a second. She had survived the Syndicate's ambush, but in the arena, every victory was fleeting. The digital landscape around her shifted, almost as if it were responding to her thoughts, the crumbling buildings fading into new terrain. Another challenge was imminent, and she had no intention of being caught unprepared. She glanced at the timer in the corner of her vision. Challenge 2. The Gauntlet. Time limit, 30 minutes. Objective: reach the control room before the perimeter collapses. A sense of urgency clawed at her. The Gauntlet was one of the most notorious challenges in the arena. A test of speed, agility, and decision-making. The environment itself was rigged with traps, automated turrets, and collapsing structures. The clock was ticking, and the only way out was to complete the objective. But there was one problem. She didn't know where the control room was. Mila scanned the area, trying to make sense of the shifting terrain. The plaza had transformed into a sprawling industrial complex, massive walls towering over her, a labyrinth of catwalks, staircases, and rusting machinery. She could hear the distant hum of motors and the faint hiss of hydraulics. The place reeked of danger. Her breath caught as a new notification flashed across her vision. Warning: perimeter breach in 10 minutes. Proceed to the control room for safety. The perimeter collapse was imminent, but the control room was still hidden from sight. She needed a way in, and she needed it now. Mila's instincts kicked in. She reached for her weapons, checking her ammo and adjusting her grenades. Her rifle was ready, but she knew that brute force wouldn't get her through this. It never did. The arena had a way of wearing down even the most prepared players. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Time to move. Mila moved cautiously through the complex, every step measured, her eyes darting around for any sign of movement. She knew the game's AI would throw everything it had at her. More traps, more enemies, and perhaps even more surprises. But it wasn't just the game she had to worry about now. The other players were still out there, too. The floor beneath her feet groaned ominously as she made her way past a massive assembly line, its gears and conveyor belts frozen in time. As she rounded a corner, she almost collided with a group of players, a trio of heavily armed individuals who had clearly made it this far through the gauntlet. They froze at the sight of her, their weapons trained on her instantly. Mila's eyes narrowed, calculating the odds. She didn't have the advantage in numbers, but she had speed. And she wasn't about to let these players get in her way. One of them, a tall man with dark hair and a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "You're not getting past us," he growled, his rifle aimed directly at her chest. Mila's mind raced. She needed a plan, fast. These players were too close to fight without being overwhelmed, but there was still time to use the environment to her advantage. She glanced up at the ceiling, spotting a network of overhead pipes and catwalks, a potential escape route. She calculated her move, timing it perfectly. "You really think I'm just going to give up?" she said, her voice laced with confidence. The scarred man smirked, clearly underestimating her. "I think you're about to die, actually." With a sudden motion, Mila hurled one of her grenades toward the ground at their feet. The explosion was a deafening roar, sending players scattering for cover. Mila darted to the side, her feet carrying her up the nearest ladder to an overhead platform, her body moving like a shadow as she leapt from one platform to the next. Her heart raced, the sound of gunfire ringing in her ears, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. Below, the trio regrouped, their shots missing by inches as they tried to land a clean hit on her. She reached a higher level, the catwalk stretching above her like a tangled web. The view from up here was both a blessing and a curse. She could see the control room in the distance, just a few more levels up. But the ground below was littered with traps, automated sentries ready to fire on anyone who got too close. The timer on the side of her HUD ticked down. 12 minutes remaining. Mila gritted her teeth. She had to get there. She had to find that control room. The sound of footsteps echoed below, and she knew the trio was still on her tail. They were relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had her cornered. Mila couldn't afford to be distracted. She had to make it to the control room. The arena seemed to respond to her need for speed, its walls shifting once again. A massive door clanged open to her right, revealing a series of narrow hallways leading deeper into the complex. Mila didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the door, hoping it would take her in the right direction as she entered the hallway. Her HUD lit up with another warning. "Danger. Hostile proximity detected. Prepare for combat." Her grip tightened on her rifle as the hallway narrowed. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the air grew thick with the smell of oil and rust. She rounded a corner and found herself face to face with a massive sentry bot. A hulking mechanical creature with a glowing red eye and massive, rotating cannons mounted on its sides. It was armed and ready, and it wouldn't hesitate to fire. Mila didn't wait to be caught in its crosshairs. She leapt to the side, narrowly avoiding a blast that tore through the air, the shockwave rattling the walls. She barely regained her balance before the bot fired again, its powerful cannons spitting out streams of bullets. Her mind raced as she scrambled for cover. She needed to disable the sentry, but it was heavily armored. A direct assault wouldn't work. Instead, she focused on her environment. She spotted a weak point, a vent above the sentry's head. If she could climb to it, she might be able to drop a grenade into the bot's interior. She didn't think twice. Mila grabbed a nearby pipe and used it to vault herself up, her hands slipping into place as she swung into the vent. The sentry fired again, its bullets missing her by inches as she scrambled for the opening. Mila reached into her pack, pulling out one of her remaining grenades. She primed it, holding her breath as she angled herself just right. With a swift motion, she tossed the grenade into the sentry's exposed interior. The explosion rocked the bot, and its glowing red eye flickered out. It crashed to the ground, its mechanical body disintegrating into sparks and debris. Mila exhaled in relief, wiping the sweat from her brow. The path ahead was clear, but the time was slipping away. She had only a few minutes left to make it to the control room. She didn't hesitate. Moving faster than before, Mila pushed forward, the looming challenge ahead still uncertain. The arena was always changing, and the game was far from over. Chapter 5. The final countdown. Mila's heart pounded as she dashed down the narrow hallway, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the empty space. Every corner she turned felt like a gamble, every shadow a potential threat. The walls around her pulsed with a strange, mechanical hum, and she couldn't help but feel like the arena itself was alive, watching her, anticipating her every move. Time was running out. The timer in her HUD displayed 5 minutes remaining, and the distant whir of automated turrets signaled that the final stretch was going to be the most dangerous yet. Mila could hear the soft hum of energy weapons charging, the kind of sound that made her blood run cold. These weren't your average enemies. These were high-tech, near-indestructible machines, and they weren't going to miss. The hallway ahead split into 3 paths: left, center, and right. Each one led deeper into the maze of steel, and from the looks of it, each had its own set of dangers. The left path was bathed in a sickly green light, its shadows twitching with movement. The center was a long, open corridor, exposed to whatever was lurking beyond. The right path was barely lit, the walls crumbling, leaving jagged edges that would make it difficult to move silently. Mila's instincts screamed at her to pick the left path. It was a gamble, but the green light suggested something or someone was hiding there. If she could use that to her advantage, she could get closer to the control room. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and made her choice. The left path. As she entered the corridor, her eyes adjusted to the eerie glow. The walls flickered with static, and Mila instinctively ducked behind a stack of crates, peering around the corner. Her breath caught in her throat as she spotted the movement. A group of players, the ones she'd fought off earlier, were standing at the far end of the hallway. They hadn't noticed her yet, but their presence posed a new problem. The 3 of them were geared up with the latest tech: laser-guided rifles, energy shields, and grenades. If she tried to take them head-on, she'd be outnumbered and outgunned. Mila's mind raced. The timer was still ticking, and she couldn't afford to waste more time. The control room was close, she could feel it. But these players were in her way, and they wouldn't hesitate to take her down. She needed to think fast. Without warning, she sprinted forward, ducking low as she used the crates for cover. She could hear the players arguing amongst themselves, oblivious to her presence. Mila's plan was simple: divide and conquer. She pulled a flashbang from her belt and tossed it down the hallway. The explosion was instantaneous. Blinding white light filled the corridor, followed by the sound of startled shouts and gunfire as the players scrambled for cover. Mila didn't waste a second. She moved, fast and silent, weaving between obstacles as she approached them. The chaos worked to her advantage, the players disoriented and struggling to regain their bearings. She found her target, the leader of the group, a burly man with a scar across his face. He was crouched behind a wall, his hand reaching for a grenade. Mila took a breath, steadied her rifle, and fired. The shot landed perfectly, hitting the grenade before it could be thrown, causing a massive explosion that sent the leader flying back. The remaining players were thrown into confusion. Mila took advantage of their distraction, sprinting forward and knocking one of them to the ground with a well-placed kick. The third player, a woman with short-cropped hair, spun around in panic, but Mila was already there, a knife pressed to her throat. "Don't move," Mila said, her voice cold and commanding. The woman froze, her eyes wide with fear. "Why are you doing this?" the woman gasped, her voice trembling. "We're all just trying to survive." Mila didn't answer. There was no time for words. She shoved the woman aside, knocking her into the crates with enough force to disorient her, before turning to deal with the last player, the one who had managed to recover. He was fast. Too fast. The man raised his rifle and fired in quick succession, but Mila had already anticipated his moves. She dove to the side, rolling across the floor to gain some distance. Her rifle was in her hands again, and she fired once, twice. The man fell, his body dissolving into pixels as the bullet hit its mark. Mila's chest heaved as she stood over the fallen players, taking a moment to catch her breath. She wasn't sure why, but part of her felt a flicker of remorse. They were just like her, fighting for survival in a world where death could come at any moment. But that was the way of the arena. Weakness wasn't tolerated. She had no choice but to move forward. The timer flashed 3 minutes remaining. She glanced down at the bodies and took the weapons and medkits from their fallen forms. No sense in letting that gear go to waste. She didn't have time to loot everything, but the basics would be enough. Mila turned and sprinted down the hallway, her boots pounding against the metal floor. She had to reach the control room before the countdown ended. The door was ahead. She could see the faint outline of it, an entry panel glowing just ahead. It was guarded by another sentry bot, its massive body moving slowly as it patrolled the area. There was no room for hesitation. Mila pulled a grenade from her belt and tossed it at the sentry. The explosion was deafening, and the bot crumpled to the ground, its body mangled and sparks flying from its shattered circuits. The door to the control room opened with a low hiss. Mila took a deep breath, stepping inside. The control room was exactly what she had imagined. A cavernous, high-tech space filled with screens, terminals, and blinking lights. At the far end stood a massive console, the only thing that could stop the perimeter collapse. But the console wasn't unguarded. A figure stood next to it, clad in sleek armor with an insignia Mila recognized immediately. Alpha, the last person she wanted to see. The mastermind behind this entire hellish game. The one who controlled everything. "You've done well to make it this far, Mila," Alpha said, his voice smooth and calm. "But you're too late. The countdown has already begun." Mila's heart sank. She had been so close. "Why?" she asked, her voice tight with frustration. "Why make us play this game? Why put us through this?" Alpha stepped forward, his face obscured by his helmet. "Because it's the only way to ensure survival in a world like this. The strong survive and the weak perish. You've done well to get here, but you won't make it out alive." The timer on the wall ticked down to 1 minute remaining. Mila knew she couldn't afford to waste another second. She raised her rifle, aiming directly at Alpha's chest. "This ends now," she said. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. The tension in the control room was palpable, the air thick with the hum of machinery and the steady ticking of the countdown timer on the wall. Mila's pulse raced as she stood facing Alpha, her rifle raised, aiming at the figure who had orchestrated the nightmare she was living, the one who had pushed her and every other player into this deadly game of survival. Alpha didn't move, his face still hidden behind the cold, metallic visor of his helmet. But Mila could feel the weight of his gaze, the power he exuded even without speaking a word. "You won't shoot," Alpha said, his voice calm, as if he had already won. "You're too smart for that." Mila's fingers tightened around the rifle's grip. She had no intention of hesitating. She had come this far, fought too many battles, survived too many close calls, to back down now. The control room's steel walls seemed to close in around her, urging her to make a decision. The countdown ticked down relentlessly. 30 seconds remaining. She took a step forward, her eyes locked on Alpha's. "I'm not afraid of you. I'm here to end this once and for all." Alpha chuckled, the sound cold and mocking. "You think you can stop the game? You think you can undo everything that's been done? This world has changed, Mila. It's too late for that." His words cut through the air, but they didn't shake her resolve. The stakes were too high now. She had no intention of playing by his rules anymore. Mila took another step forward, her voice steady. "The game ends when I say it ends." She lunged, her rifle still aimed at Alpha, but in the split second she moved, Alpha's hand darted to his belt, and a sharp metallic clang echoed through the room as he activated his weapon. A sleek energy blade that glowed a dangerous blue. Mila barely had time to react as Alpha swung the blade at her with lightning speed. She instinctively ducked, the hum of the blade slicing through the air above her. Her rifle's barrel lowered just in time to deflect another swipe of the blade. But the force of the impact sent her staggering back. Alpha's eyes, hidden beneath his visor, never left her. "You're out of your depth, Mila. This is beyond you." But Mila wasn't backing down. She had fought through every obstacle thrown her way, and she wasn't about to fall short now. She ducked low, her boots skidding across the smooth floor, and launched herself forward, aiming for Alpha's exposed side. For a split second, she saw the flicker of surprise in his posture. He wasn't expecting her to fight back with such determination. She took the opportunity and slammed her shoulder into his midsection, knocking him off balance for just a moment. But that moment was enough. Mila twisted out of his grasp, stepping back quickly as she readied her rifle. Alpha's eyes narrowed as he regained his footing, the energy blade still crackling with power in his hand. He was fast, too fast for her to simply shoot and hope for the best. But she wasn't going to rely solely on brute force. She had to outsmart him. She feigned a shot, firing toward the ground near his feet. Alpha flinched, just enough for her to see a glint of hesitation. That was the opening she needed. Mila fired again, this time hitting the control panel beside Alpha with precision. Sparks flew as the electrical systems shorted out. The lights flickered, and the screens along the walls blinked off, plunging the room into temporary darkness. It was a risky move. She wasn't sure how much of the system she had just disabled, but in that split second of darkness, she lunged forward. She didn't need to see Alpha's movements to know where he was. The moment the lights blinked back on, she found herself on him, pushing him toward the control console. He struggled against her grip, but Mila was stronger than she'd ever been. This was it, the moment she'd been waiting for. She could feel the weight of the rifle against her shoulder, her breath coming in short bursts as she tightened her grip on it. Alpha's resistance faltered, his energy blade now lying discarded on the ground. Mila didn't give him a chance to recover. She swung the butt of her rifle into his chest, knocking the wind out of him. He staggered back, his hand clutching at his throat as he gasped for air. "You've been playing God for too long," Mila said, her voice cold, her eyes filled with the fury of a woman who had been pushed to the brink. "It's over." She turned back to the control panel, her fingers flying over the terminals. The countdown was still ticking down. 10 seconds remaining. Mila's heart raced as she frantically searched for the system override. Her mind was spinning, but there was no room for error. If she didn't shut down the game now, the arena would collapse, and everyone trapped inside would be lost forever. She found it, the shutdown sequence. Her fingers hovered over the keys. She hesitated, a part of her wondering what would happen once she completed the sequence. What would become of the arena, of all the players? Would they be set free, or would they be stuck in the game for good? There was no time to second-guess herself. 0.5 seconds remaining. She hit the final key. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low hum, the entire control room shook. The walls flickered as if something enormous had been triggered. Mila's heart stopped. 0. The countdown ended. And with it, everything went silent. Mila stood there, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She waited for the explosion, the collapse, the inevitable end. But instead, the walls around her shifted, the floor beneath her feet steady and unyielding. The air was still. The system, it was shutting down. She turned to face Alpha, who was still struggling to catch his breath. But something had changed in his demeanor. The once imposing figure seemed smaller now, defeated, almost human. He was no longer the orchestrator of the game, the man who controlled life and death. Now, he was just another player, another victim of the system he had created. You really did it?" Alpha rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Mila didn't answer. She didn't need to. The arena was ending, and that was all that mattered. But as she stood there, watching the control room systems power down, something else flickered in her mind. A realization that had been gnawing at her since the moment she stepped into the game. This was far from over. There were more games to be played, more battles to fight. The world outside had its own set of rules, and the arena might have been only the beginning. Mila walked toward the door, her rifle slung over her shoulder. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going down without a fight. The arena had been a test, and she had passed. But the real challenge was only just beginning. Chapter 7: Aftermath. The silence in the control room was deafening. The system hums that had once filled the space with a constant, mechanical drone had faded, leaving behind only the echoes of Mila's racing heartbeat. She stood in the center of the room, her rifle lowered to the floor, staring at the now-dim terminals and the flickering lights above her head. Alpha, the man who had once been the embodiment of control and power within the arena, was slumped against the console, his face hidden behind his helmet. He hadn't moved much since the system shut down, his entire posture defeated. The game had ended, but it was impossible to ignore the sense of foreboding that weighed heavily on Mila's chest. She hadn't killed him. For some reason, she hadn't been able to bring herself to do it. Maybe it was because he hadn't been the mastermind she thought him to be. He was just another victim of the game, just like everyone else. Or maybe, despite everything, Mila still believed in the possibility of something better. She couldn't be sure. "Are you going to leave me here to rot?" Alpha's voice broke through the silence. It was hoarse, tired, almost desperate. He had no power now. His tone was a far cry from the cold confidence he'd carried in their earlier confrontations. Mila didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved toward one of the remaining terminals and activated it, hoping to gain some insight into what exactly had just happened. She had deactivated the arena's main system, but there were too many questions left unanswered. The terminal hummed to life, and a series of text messages appeared on the screen. It wasn't a game reset. The messages were too cryptic to interpret fully at first glance. But one word caught her attention: exit protocol. She had done it. The exit protocol was the fail-safe mechanism for players who managed to survive the system's deadly challenges. It was designed to give players a way out of the game, but only if they completed specific conditions. Mila hadn't realized it at the time, but that's what she had activated when she entered the shutdown sequence. The game was over. The arena was collapsing, and they were free. "Do you understand what just happened?" she finally asked. Not turning to look at Alpha, he chuckled darkly, the sound of it grating against Mila's nerves. "Oh, I understand. You've destroyed the game. But you think that means everything goes back to normal? You think the world outside will welcome you with open arms? You're wrong." Mila's lips pressed into a thin line, a knot of unease forming in her stomach. Alpha's words stung because, deep down, she knew there was truth to them. The world she had fought so hard to survive in wasn't going to magically repair itself just because the game was over. It had all been built on corruption, on survival at any cost. The systems, the players, the people in charge, none of them would simply fade away. Before she could speak, a series of beeping sounds filled the room. Another message flashed on the terminal. Exit protocol confirmed. Mila's heart skipped a beat. The screen blinked twice, and then a new line of text appeared, clearer than before. Players have been removed from the system. She blinked. She wasn't sure what it meant. Had the other players been freed as well? Was she the only one who had survived? The terminal continued its output, but before Mila could read more, the room's door slid open with a soft hiss. Her hand instinctively went to her side, reaching for the sidearm holstered at her hip. But when she turned to face the doorway, it wasn't another player, nor was it an enemy. It was a group of figures, their forms silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway beyond. Mila didn't lower her weapon. She had been burned too many times to trust strangers in this world. The figures stepped forward, and the dim lighting revealed their faces, familiar faces. Mila recognized them immediately. It was the rest of the survivors. The players she had fought beside or against throughout the arena. They weren't dead. They hadn't been lost in the chaos. They had been freed, just like her. Among them was Kale, the quiet sharpshooter who had stuck with Mila through the most brutal challenges. He gave her a small, tight-lipped smile, one that didn't reach his eyes, but still offered a semblance of warmth. Next to him was Zara, the tactical genius who had come up with several of the plans that kept the group alive. Behind them were others, faces both unfamiliar and familiar, some bearing the same exhausted expressions, others showing signs of relief. Mila felt a rush of conflicting emotions. A part of her felt relief. These were the people she had fought with, trusted with her life, and they had made it through. But another part of her was uneasy. Could they really move on? Was it possible to start over after everything they had endured? Is it really over? Kale's voice broke the silence, his tone hesitant. Mila nodded, but her thoughts were still racing. It's over. The game is done. The arena is gone. Zara let out a deep breath, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time since Mila had met her. I didn't think we'd make it. I thought we'd be stuck in that hellhole forever. We almost were, Mila muttered. Her eyes drifted back to Alpha, still sitting motionless against the control panel. But not all of us made it out. Kale's gaze flickered toward Alpha, his eyes narrowing. Is he alive? Mila didn't answer at first, studying the fallen figure. For now, she said, her voice betraying a flicker of uncertainty. But I'm not sure what happens next. He's just as much a victim of this game as the rest of us. Zara crossed her arms. So what now? What do we do with the world that's been destroyed? We've won the game, but we haven't won back our lives. Mila sighed deeply. She had no clear answers. They were free, yes, but the truth was they were stepping into a broken world. The system that had controlled them was no more, but the reality outside had been shattered long before they ever entered the arena. We rebuild, Mila said quietly. We start from here. We figure out how to make things right, one step at a time. Her words weren't a solution, but they were all they had. Mila turned to face the others, her mind still racing with possibilities. The world they were walking into wasn't going to be easy, but she wasn't backing down. They had survived the worst the arena had to offer. Now it was time to survive what came next. Chapter 8. The long road ahead. The world outside the arena was a far cry from the digital construct that had held them captive. When Mila stepped into the world beyond the steel walls, the difference hit her like a gust of cold air. The bright sunlight was blinding at first, after so long in the sterile, artificial light of the arena. The landscape stretched before her. Empty roads, abandoned buildings, and overgrown vegetation that had taken back much of the land. The survivors stood around her, each of them taking in the sight with a mixture of disbelief and apprehension. They had fought their way through hell, each challenge deadlier than the last, and now they were free. But what did that freedom even mean? Zara adjusted the strap of her bag and glanced around at the barren cityscape. I didn't think it would be like this. I thought maybe things would be different when we made it out. Mila's heart weighed heavy in her chest. She had thought the same. They had imagined escape, getting out, leaving behind the deadly game and returning to a world of normalcy. But the truth was, the world outside wasn't what it used to be. It wasn't just the arena that had been corrupted. The entire society had fallen apart. The rules of survival had shifted long before they were dragged into the game. We don't know the full picture yet, Mila said quietly, scanning the horizon. She had no clear answers, but she wasn't ready to give up. Not why they moved through the city. The silence was suffocating. There were no signs of life, no people, no cars. Just empty streets that seemed to have been forgotten by time. A few rusted vehicles littered the roads, some on their sides, some abandoned in a hurry. It was as if civilization had simply stopped, leaving its skeleton behind. Where is everyone? Kale asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He had been through the worst of the arena, but nothing could have prepared him for this eerie stillness. I don't know, Mila replied, her voice flat. But we need to find out. They had no idea how long it had been since the game ended. Hours? Days? Weeks? Time had become irrelevant within the arena, and now, as they stepped into the unknown, it was impossible to measure how much of the world had crumbled in their absence. Zara spotted a small building up ahead, a grocery store, its windows shattered and the sign above it barely hanging on. Let's check there, she suggested, motioning toward the building. We might find something useful. Mila nodded, leading the way as they approached the store. As they entered, the smell of decay hit them. Food gone bad, air stale from disuse. Shelves that were once stocked with provisions were now empty or overturned. Still, Mila couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign that anyone had even been here in a long time. It was as though the people had simply vanished. "Nothing?" Cale muttered, his voice tinged with frustration as he sifted through some empty cans. "This place has been picked clean." Mila's eyes lingered on the back of the store. A door led into what looked like a storage room, and a faint light flickered through the cracks. "We should check back there." Zara raised an eyebrow. "You really think someone's hiding in there?" Mila couldn't explain it, but something in her gut told her that they weren't alone. "We won't know unless we look." They moved toward the back of the store cautiously, checking their surroundings. Mila pushed open the door to the storage room. The flickering light grew brighter as they stepped inside, revealing a series of makeshift beds, crates, and supplies stacked in the corner. The room appeared to be some kind of refuge, a hidden place. "Who would stay here?" Cale asked, looking around. Mila didn't have an answer, but her eyes fell on something, a small, battered journal on one of the crates. She walked over and picked it up, flipping through the pages. It was written in a frantic scrawl, the handwriting uneven, as though the writer was in a hurry. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the first few lines. "The world's gone dark. People are disappearing. I don't know how much longer we have." The words sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't just some random outpost. Someone had been here, and they were writing as if they knew the world was falling apart. Zara leaned over her shoulder, reading the page. "What's that supposed to mean? Who would write something like this?" Mila continued to flip through the journal, her mind racing. The entries grew more chaotic, filled with warnings, strange symbols, and cryptic messages. It was clear that whoever had written this had been living in fear. There was something much larger at play here than just the arena. The game was part of something bigger, something far more insidious. "We need to find more answers," Mila said, closing the journal and tucking it into her bag. "This isn't just about survival anymore. There's something happening to the world, and we need to figure out what." As they prepared to leave the store, Mila couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she scanned the room once more. But there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the flickering light. The group made their way back into the street, the silence oppressive. They had no destination, no plan other than to move forward. But Mila's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information she had. Something was happening to the world. The arena had been only the beginning. They continued through the city, searching for any sign of life, any clue that might tell them what had happened. Hours passed, and the sense of desolation only grew. Every building they passed, every street corner they turned, seemed to reinforce the feeling that civilization had ended. And then, in the distance, Mila saw something, movement, a figure. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her. But the figure was real. A person, walking slowly down the street toward them. Mila froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Who could it be? Were they friend or foe? She motioned for the group to stay low, crouching behind a wall. They waited in silence as the figure drew closer. Mila's eyes narrowed as she tried to make out the figure's face. Whoever it was, they weren't alone. Two others followed behind, equally as cautious. The person in the lead reached the end of the street and turned toward them. The face was familiar, too familiar. It was one of the original players from the arena. Chapter 9. Revelations. The air around Mila seemed to thicken as the figure drew closer. Every instinct in her screamed to stay hidden, to remain out of sight. But her curiosity gnawed at her, compelling her to step forward just slightly, enough to get a better look. The figure who approached was none other than Leo, one of the strongest players in the arena. He had been part of the group that Mila had briefly aligned with during their earlier trials. His cold eyes and calculating demeanor had made him a formidable adversary, and his skills in combat were unmatched. But there was something about him now, something different. He was no longer the well-maintained, ruthless player who had walked the arena's deadly halls. His clothes were ragged, his face gaunt, as though the weight of everything that had happened was finally taking its toll on him. Behind him, two others followed, one man and one woman. Both looked as worn down as Leo, but there was something almost haunting about their eyes. They looked resigned. Mila took a hesitant step forward. Her heart pounded in her chest. The others in her group remained silent, staying back in the shadows, observing. "Leo?" she called out, her voice unsure. Leo froze. For a split second, he didn't seem to recognize her. Then his eyes sharpened, and he squinted into the dimming light. His lips curled slightly into a grim, tired smile. "Mila?" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. But there was recognition followed by something else, something she couldn't place. "I didn't expect to see you out here." Mila didn't know how to respond. They had been through so much in the arena, and yet here outside, it felt like a different world entirely. "We all got out," she said slowly. "I didn't think anyone else was left. What happened?" Leo stepped forward cautiously, glancing behind him to the two figures who followed him. He didn't seem as defensive as he had been in the arena, but Mila wasn't sure if that was a sign of trust or something else. "This world," Leo began, his voice low, "it's not what you think. You didn't just escape the arena. The whole system, the game we were forced into, it was just a distraction. A cover-up." The words hit Mila like a punch. "What do you mean? The game, it wasn't real." Leo shook his head, and his expression darkened. "It was real enough for us, wasn't it? We lived through it. But that's not the point. The game, the arena, it was all designed to keep us in the dark, to keep us busy. The real game is bigger than we ever imagined." Mila's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about? What real game?" Leo's eyes flicked to the two people with him, his companions, and they stepped forward, each of them nodding in agreement. "This," said the woman, her voice raspy, "isn't just about survival. It's about control. The people who orchestrated the arena, they didn't just create a virtual world for us to fight in. They've been controlling the entire population. They've been using us as pawns to test their systems, to build something worse than we can imagine." Mila felt her stomach twist with unease. She had known things were broken, but this was more than she had ever anticipated. "What are they building?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Leo's companion, the man, spoke this time. "A new world order. They've been manipulating people for years, through games, through propaganda, through every corner of society. And now the arena was just a part of the experiment. They've been testing how far they can push people, how far they can drive them before they snap. Zara stepped forward, her brow furrowed in confusion. But how did you know? How are you still alive? Leo let out a bitter laugh. I know because I was one of them, or I used to be. Mila's breath caught in her throat. You were working with them? Leo nodded, his face hardening. I was a part of their system, an enforcer. I didn't know the full scope of it at first, but when I started to see the patterns, the way they controlled everything, I realized it was bigger than any of us. The woman beside Leo spoke again, her voice trembling. We were part of a group that was testing out different strategies, how people would react to different pressures, different environments. But then it went too far. We couldn't back out anymore. The system had us trapped. So, you're telling me the arena wasn't the only test? Mila asked, her mind racing. That this whole world is part of some grand experiment? Leo nodded grimly. Exactly. The arena was just one piece of it. And we were the test subjects. They've been manipulating every part of society. Wars, economies, even the media. They've been building something so much darker than we ever could have imagined. Mila tried to process the weight of his words. It was one thing to have survived the arena, but this was a different level of chaos. If the world they'd known had been controlled by a few powerful people behind the scenes, who were now manipulating even the air they breathed, how could they even hope to fight back? We need to stop them, Zara said, her voice firm. If everything is connected, we can't just walk away. We need to find out how deep this goes and how to shut it all down. Mila's thoughts swirled. The idea of fighting such an enormous force felt almost impossible. But she could see the determination in her companions' faces, especially Leo's. Despite his past, there was something in him now that felt different, something more resolved. We'll have to work together, Mila said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. There's no way we can fight this alone. Leo's eyes met hers. For the first time since they had crossed paths again, his gaze softened. You're right. Together we stand a chance. Mila didn't know what the future held or how much of this dark system they could tear down. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like there was hope. The arena had taken so much from them. Now they had the chance to take back what was theirs, and they would fight with everything they had. Chapter 10. The Final Stand. The weight of their mission settled heavily on Mila's shoulders as the group made their way through the crumbling city. The idea of taking down the system that had controlled their lives for so long felt overwhelming. But with each step, that weight seemed to lift, replaced by something far stronger, determination. They had learned from Leo and his companions that the game had never been about just survival. It had been a means to an end, a test of human limits, and now they had to face the true enemy, the organization behind the game, a shadowy network of powerful individuals who had manipulated everything, the wars, the economy, the very fabric of society. Now it was their turn to fight back. Mila could feel the pulse of something larger than herself in the air. The city around them, broken and abandoned, seemed like a battlefield, a place where the echoes of the past still lingered, waiting for the final confrontation. The stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming their world. We're getting close, Leo said, his voice tight with urgency as he led the group toward an old government facility at the edge of the city. This is where they've been operating from. The heart of it all. Mila glanced around. The streets were eerily quiet. The once thriving city now a ghost town. Whatever had happened to the people, it seemed that those still alive were either hiding or had already become part of the system. This was it, the final stronghold of the forces that had brought them all to the brink of destruction. They reached the entrance, a massive, fortified structure with high walls and surveillance systems. It was clearly designed to keep people out, but it was also a symbol of power, control, and fear. "How do we get inside?" Kale asked. His eyes scanning the perimeter. Leo's eyes narrowed as he looked up at the facility. "We don't have time for subtlety. They know we're coming." Before Mila could respond, the sound of a door slamming open echoed through the air. Armed guards stepped into view, their weapons raised. Mila's heart skipped a beat. They had been waiting for this moment, and it was happening now. "Stay close," Mila whispered, turning to her group. "We fight our way in. We can't turn back now." A rush of adrenaline surged through her, and the fight that had been brewing in her for weeks finally broke loose. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a leader, a force that would not be ignored. The guards advanced, but Mila's group was faster. With swift movements, they took down the first wave of soldiers, each of them working together, no longer strangers or enemies, but allies with a single goal. That as they pushed forward, Leo's face remained tense, his eyes scanning the battlefield. He had been a part of the system, but now he was fighting to dismantle it. The betrayal that had once filled him with guilt now fueled his resolve. This was his redemption. Zara fought fiercely, her training from the arena giving her an edge as she dodged and struck with precision. Kale, though more hesitant than the others, found his footing as they moved deeper into the compound. The building loomed ahead, a fortress of steel and glass, and Mila knew that inside lay the heart of the system, the control center, the nerve center of everything that had ruined their lives. She could almost feel the eyes of those in power watching them through unseen cameras, their fingers hovering over buttons that could wipe them out at any moment. But Mila wasn't afraid anymore. They reached the entrance, a large steel door reinforced with layers of security. Without hesitation, Leo stepped forward, pulling a device from his bag. "I've been working on this," he said, his voice low but steady. "We'll need to override the security protocols to get in." Mila nodded. "Do it. We don't have much time." Leo inserted the device, and after a few tense moments, the door clicked open, revealing a long corridor. The walls were lined with computers, wires, and blinking lights, an electronic heartbeat of the system. Mila felt a surge of anger and hope collide within her. This was it, the endgame. They moved quickly, bypassing several guards along the way, until they reached the control room. Inside, a row of monitors lit up, displaying maps, data streams, and surveillance footage from around the city. The people in charge were watching them closely. Mila stepped forward, her resolve unwavering. "This ends now." The room went silent as the figures in charge, the architects of the game, appeared on the main screen. Their faces were hidden behind digital masks, their voices distorted. "You think you can stop us?" one of them asked, the voice cold and mechanical. "You think you've won?" Mila's heart raced, but she stood tall, facing the screen. "We're not here to win. We're here to end this. All of it. Your game ends now." With that, Leo activated the device he had carried with him, overriding the system's controls. The screens flickered, and for a moment, everything went black. The room was silent for a beat, then the lights came back on, and the monitors displayed something unexpected. Chaos. The system that had once been so carefully controlled was now unraveling. The foundation of their power was crumbling. "They're losing control," Kale muttered, his eyes wide with disbelief. Mila's pulse quickened as she watched the monitors. What had once seemed like an impenetrable fortress was now a house of cards. The game was ending, and the people who had controlled it were finally being exposed for who they were. Mila turned to Leo. "It's over. We did it." Leo nodded, a sense of peace settling over his face. He had come full circle, from a pawn in the game to the one who had helped bring it down. They had all done their part, and the system that had tried to destroy them was no more. Outside, the world seemed to breathe again. The air felt different now, lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from the earth. But it wasn't over, not yet. There would be challenges ahead, a world to rebuild, and lives to reclaim. But they had taken the first step. Mila looked out at the horizon, where the sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light over the ruined city. For the first time in a long while, she felt hope. Hope for herself, for her friends, and for a future that was no longer defined by the game. "We survived," she said, a smile tugging at her lips. "And now we fight for something better." And with that, they walked out of the control room, ready to face whatever came next, together.